Hello, and welcome to State of Our Workforce Unpacked, where we'll dig deeper into the incredibly impactful work our network partners are doing across the country. My name is Henry Danner, and I'm the Manager of Network Engagement at Shift Work Forward. Today, I'm joined by our friends Rob Hope, Director at ReWork the Bay, and Brianna Rogers, Initiative Officer at ReWork the Bay. Together, we're going to unpack how ReWork's organizational model utilizes proximate grant making to provide critical resources to systemically excluded workers and empower them to be job quality change agents. We'll also discuss how their model fueled a recent collaborative effort with North Bay Jobs with Justice and Santa Rosa Junior College to infuse worker rights and safety into a wildfire resilience training for landscaping and agricultural workers in Sonoma County, California. Rob and Brianna, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
We're
Doing
doing
great.
good.
Thanks
I'm
for
doing
having us.
great. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. So I've gotten a chance to know a little bit about rework during my time here at Shift Work Forward and a little bit about how you work, right? So I'm very excited for us to share that with our listeners and viewers. So let's dive right in. Brianna, the first question is coming to you. Most people are familiar with the traditional form of grant making, which usually involves large donors giving money, and usually coming from philanthropic organizations, giving money to communities in need. Usually, they're from a distance; they're a little bit farther removed from those communities. But I've heard about this other version of grant making called proximate grant making. I actually learned it from you all. I'm not even ashamed to admit that you all taught me that, right? So why don't you help our listeners understand, what proximate grant making actually is and what role does it generally play in philanthropic giving?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I am so happy to be here. Um, and let's just jump right in. So, at its core, proximate grant making is about closing the distance between decision makers and the people most impacted by those decisions. Like you said, traditionally, philanthropy operates pretty much from a distance. Funders make
Mhm.
decisions based on proposals, right? Reports, metrics. But what's often missing is the real, true, lived experience, the nuance, right? And the real time insight from the communities closest to the challenges. So, proximate grant making flips that. It brings
Mhm.
community voice, worker voice, practitioner insight directly into how funding decisions are shaped. Not just feedback, right? Or an advisory council, like everyone likes to do. They like to have
Mhm.
we're guided by a community advisory council, right?
Yeah.
But in actuality, those spaces don't have any real true power. Um, they have influence, but no true power. And we were called out on that, right, by our Equity at Work Council. And so a couple years ago, we were called out. We had an advisory board called our Equity at Work Council. And the question came up: how are we any different than any other advisory council? How are you really shifting power to us?
Mhm.
And so we made the decision to really truly shift power. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't overnight, right? People talk about it all the time, but what does it look like in actual practice to shift and to share power with communities? And that's exactly what the proximate grant making model is for ReWork the Bay. And what that does is it shifts funding from being transactional, just moving dollars, traditional pass through funding, right, to being
Mhm.
catalytic. Um, and where those dollars are actually aligned with what communities know will work, because we're literally guided by those communities. We're guided by our Equity at Work Council. They guide our strategy, they guide our grant making, they approve every dollar that goes out. So it's not just about where money goes, it's about who has power to shape where it goes.
Mhm.
It's about funding with people, right, not just for people. And so that's proximate philanthropy, and that goes a step further than trust-based philanthropy.
Thank you. I love that. You said so many words that just like got my skin tingling. Power was one of them. You said that a few times, and then voice is another one, right? And Rob, I'm gonna shift over to you to talk a little bit more about that. Reworks core One of Reworks core values is centering the voice of workers, um, and including their ideas in the design of solutions. So, can you tell us about what are some tangible ways that proximate grant making enables you to do that, enables that, and sort of like powers your strategic approach to building worker power?
Definitely. Thanks, Henry. I'm really happy to be here with you today. Thanks for the opportunity. So, we sort of approach our work at ReWork the Bay wanting to see what's possible. The field of workforce development and economic development is really dominated by narratives of what isn't possible and what things don't work and what strategies shouldn't be pursued. Proximate philanthropy, proximate grant making helps us break through those inaccurate narratives because we're hearing directly from people who are on the ground doing the work, whose constituents are in the circumstances that we want to improve. And they have a front row seat, and it's an experiential seat of what is needed in community and what's possible in community. And so a big part of what we do is try to, through our Equity at Work Council, put out on the table what these dominant narratives are. And I'll give you an example. For a long time, conventional wisdom has been that workforce development needs to prioritize the needs of employers over workers to achieve successful outcomes. This is not a truth set in stone. This is a belief that has been developed over time through the observation of people that's been amplified throughout the media and culture. And what we really see by bringing together folks who are closer to the work is that there's new appetite for new kinds of partnerships, for new approaches that break through some of the persistent silos that prevent groups who may be fighting for job quality improvements from partnering with people who are focused on helping people access greater education and skills to further their career. And so the Equity at Work Council is a vehicle by which we bring these diverse group of leaders together to share their experience, to identify where there's commonalities in their values and what they're trying to accomplish, and then ask them to roll up their sleeves and put together plans that will actually be implementable, that can help us see what's possible when we break out of these sort of sector-based silos and start working together on shared goals.
Nice. Thanks. Thank you. That's great stuff. That Equity at Work Council sounds like they are working. They are powering a lot of what you do. And I love that. We talk about worker power, we talk about worker voice, and we talk about workers a whole lot, as we should. But I think for the average person who's not steeped in it like us, workers begin to sound like this abstract thing, right? But no, these are actual people with real lives and needs, right? And you all recently wrapped up your Builder Worker Power through Workforce Development pilot project, where you worked with workforce training providers to incorporate a Know Your Rights training and connection to worker organizing groups. And one of the groups that you work with, you focused on wildfire resilience training for immigrant, low-wage landscape and agricultural workers, right? And that is a group of people that I'm sure are very, susceptible to poor job conditions and not knowing their rights. So it's good that you went in and spoke with them. How did your style, your style of proximate grant making and the model that you work under influence how you facilitated that pilot? So can you share a little bit about that? And also, what were the goals and the outcomes of working with that very specific group of workers? So that question is open to you both.
Thanks, Henry. That project came about through these exact kind of cross-sector proximate philanthropy conversations that I was talking about earlier. So we have worker organizing leaders at the table. We have worker training leaders at the table. They see that they're trying to reach the same people in community. They're trying to serve the same people. These are people who have been disenfranchised, underserved by our systems. But they're approaching those folks from different places, different points of intersection. And they actually came to us and said, there's an opportunity to improve the way that workforce development is provided that will build worker power while also building skills and education. And for that to happen, we knew that it wasn't just going to be about writing a curriculum and rolling it out. It was going to require some on-the-ground collaboration between worker organizing groups and workforce development groups to work through some of those like sticky issues that get in the way of successful implementation of programs. And so what we ended up doing was we funded a pair of workforce development and worker organizing organizations in 4 different places in the Bay Area. So in Silicon Valley, in downtown Oakland, in downtown San Francisco, and then in the North Bay and wine country. And so the example that you pointed to with North Bay Jobs with Justice and Santa Rosa Junior College was a really powerful example of 2 organizations who really wanted to serve the Indigenous and Latinx farm worker and landscaping worker community in Silicon Valley. It's a huge workforce, a lot of undocumented folks who don't tend to take advantage of services that are available. They don't tend to use the community college because they're not comfortable with the campus. And so they came together, they figured out how they could integrate new curricula into what Santa Rosa Junior College was already designing that would be provided in the language that workers speak, that would acknowledge and lift up all of the wisdom that existed in those workers, many of whom were people who were working the land in their home countries before immigrating. Of course, in California, we have this huge need around wildfire prevention, remediation, and restoration. And those dollars don't tend to go to local workers. They tend to go to big national contractors who are set up to receive those public funds. And so what the North Bay did is they developed this pipeline where they have Indigenous and Latinx workers coming in, upgrading their skills around wildfire work, and then being organized into groups that can then apply for these contracts. So to make sure that the dollars that are going to rebuild our communities in California after wildfires and preventing them from happening in the future are also fueling economic development and workforce development and greater economic mobility for our local workers.
That's right.
Brianna, do you want to talk a little more detail about that?
Yeah, Rob, that's exactly right. And what was really different about this pilot is that we didn't just fund, right, workforce training. We kind of rethought what training is for, right? Who is training for? And are folks feeling more empowered after their trainings? We've learned that, traditional workforce programs are focused on placement, right? How quickly can someone get a job? How many people are we placing in jobs? But through our proximate approach, what we learned and heard from workers is that getting a job isn't necessarily enough if the job itself isn't safe, isn't stable, isn't dignified, right? And so, when we talk about in the wildfire resilience project specifically, working with immigrant and low wage workers, what surfaced was how much knowledge already exists, right, within these communities about safety, about risk, about adaptation, about land preservation. And so our role wasn't necessarily to insert expertise in regards to the trainings. It was to recognize it and build around it and resource it. And that's exactly what we did. And, what we saw was a real shift. It was a pretty real shift, not just in skills, obviously, but in confidence and agency. Workers begin to see themselves not just as participants in the workforce, but as advocates within it. And that's the difference, right? When you fund with proximity, you don't just build programs, you build power. And that's what we're all about, is power building.
That's awesome. I love that you highlighted that piece about not coming in with expertise, but sort of like untapping the expertise that's already within these
exactly
individuals, right? And sort of unleashing that.
Indigenous people have been taking care of our land since the beginning of time, right? And so, when we're talking about how to fight wildfires, right? Or we're talking about how to preserve our land. They've got that nailed down. It was the other aspects of the building worker power and building power that a lot of communities and groups are counted out. Right? They're not even counted in. And that's a step that's missed oftentimes when it comes to workforce development, is building that agency, right? Allowing people to kind of reimagine themselves beyond their current circumstance. And so we saw spot on that this project definitely delivered those results.
Yeah. Thank you both for that response. So we want to talk about next, like what's coming up, right? There was a report that you issued at the end of your pilot. It's on your website. I got a chance to check it out. And in that report, you listed several recommendations that were aimed at reducing barriers to workforce training. You also shared some of those same outcomes that you just mentioned regarding building confidence of the workers. So, from your perspective, Brianna, can you just talk about what next steps feel the most pressing and what ReWork is doing to kind of push for these changes that's aimed at providing equitable solutions for workers?
Yeah, for sure. There were definitely a lot of practical recommendations, right, that the report offered. And I feel like while the project itself didn't necessarily serve, I would say, a large enough sample of participants to kind of produce quantitative impact data. Service results and participant and staff feedback across 4 sites revealed some very, very potentially positive impacts, right, of this approach. In particular, we heard a range of indications that participants felt a stronger sense of agency, self-confidence, ability to advocate for themselves when needed. Of course, there were also, sorry, should I record over?
You could keep going. It's not too
Okay.
distracting.
Okay. Where was I? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But basically, increased awareness of safety guidelines and prevention of common injuries and different things, like understanding basics of labor history, right? Why there was a need of and how certain, I guess, protections and formal protections came about and were fought for and won. We talked about that. A lot of people understood their rights as workers a bit more, feeling more confident, right, that they had those rights. And so that definitely was most impactful, we felt. Of course, there were some practical recommendations like, reducing barriers to participation through innovative solutions with pay training, stipends, transportation, different times that, you can, whether it be mornings, afternoons, or evenings. Lots of folks and immigrants and our low wage workers have families, right? And so alternate and innovative, I guess, equitable access to the programming. So these were different strategies that are listed on our final report. But one of the most key takeaways was just understand the ability, giving them the tools and the ability to understand their rights, right, and connect it to a broader ecosystem of support. Something shifted internally, and I saw that in real life. We went on site visits where we were actually able to experience the trainings on our own, and we saw increased confidence, stronger self-advocacy, a clearer sense of agency. Workers weren't just kind of completing trainings; they were starting to ask different questions about their conditions and their options, right? So for us, the recommendation isn't just about adding services. It's really to rethink workforce development as a space for building worker voice and power, not just for job placement, but for sustainability on the actual individual worker themselves. And so what's next for us is to continue to push on that, working with our partners, working with our funders, systems leaders to really invest in models that integrate training with worker voice, organizing, and long-term pathways to job quality. Because honestly, if we're serious about equity, we can't just prepare people for the workforce, right? We have to really transform the workforce itself. And so even with worker power, this pilot, it was a 2-year pilot, but this has become pretty concrete and woven and institutionalized in our approach moving forward. All of our action research projects or our multi-year, even statewide projects, any project that we do for ReWork the Bay to get us towards an inclusive economy, closer to an inclusive economy, definitely has elements of worker power built in it, including our most recent community care initiative model, right? Our CCI community care initiative, where we're looking at kind of strengthening the infrastructure and what it means to raise the bottom line as just to raise the floor as it pertains to care workers in our industry. And what does that mean for, care workers to build power, and for seniors who are receiving care, or anybody who's receiving care, to also know, right, about what they have accessible to them, right, and to build that power within an infrastructure of a community, like a community care infrastructure. And so moving forward, it's a part of our blueprint, if you will, with ReWork the Bay, is to make sure that we are definitely adding elements of worker power as we're looking to modernize trainings to meet the needs of the future of workers.
Wow, wow, thank you. I mean, that sounds like exciting work ahead in terms of like taking what you learned and sort of just applying that to just the way that you're going to be moving and doing your work and implementing your project. So that's exciting, and I will certainly be keeping up with that. I want to thank you both for joining us today on Unpacked. It was really good to learn about this initiative beyond like what I knew already, and then also to help our listeners and viewers to learn and hopefully be interested in learning more. So I want to thank everybody that joined us today on LinkedIn. Make sure to follow Shift Work Forward on LinkedIn and all social media to stay up to date with state of our workforce. Tune in for future episodes where we'll definitely be continuing to explore the future of workforce equity with our network partners on State of Our Workforce Unpacked. So until then, see you all next time.